Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we least expect them. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what we were truly looking for. In the blazing heat of the Mojave Desert, 62-year-old cowboy Eli Boone found a woman collapsed beside a dry creek bed. She was maybe 50, sunburned, and wouldn't tell him her name. He simply said, "You're coming with me," and carried her back to his ranch. As she healed in his quiet home, pieces of her story came out: a broken marriage, a journey west, searching for something she couldn't name. Eli didn't ask questions. He just made her tea, fixed her boots, and showed her how to mend fences. What started as helping a stranger became something neither expected. But what happens when two people who've spent years running from their past suddenly can't run from each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was already climbing high when Eli Boone carried the unconscious woman through the weathered gate of his ranch. Dust swirled around his boots as he crossed the yard, past the old water trough where wild horses came to drink in the early morning hours. The Boone Ranch sat like a small oasis in the vastness of the Mojave, protected by a ring of cottonwood trees that his grandfather had planted 60 years ago. The main house was modest but solid, built from local stone and timber that had weathered countless desert storms. Eli shouldered open the front door, careful not to jostle his burden. The woman's breathing was shallow but steady, her sun-darkened skin hot to the touch. He carried her to the guest room, a small space that had been untouched since his wife Margaret passed 5 years ago. The bed was made with Margaret's hand-stitched quilt, the windows opened to catch the morning breeze that filtered through the cottonwoods. As he settled the woman onto the bed, Eli caught sight of the hand-carved wooden cross on the mantel in the adjoining living room. Margaret had kept it there, a reminder of the faith that had sustained her through their 37 years together. Even now, it seemed to watch over the house, a silent guardian of the values they had shared. The woman stirred as Eli adjusted the pillows behind her head. Her eyes fluttered open green as sage, he noticed, and immediately filled with wariness. She tried to sit up, but weakness forced her back against the pillows. "Easy there," Eli said, his voice gentle as he might use with a spooked horse. "You're safe, this is my place." She studied his face, taking in the weathered features, the silver beard, the kind eyes that had seen their share of hardship. Where am I?" "About 15 miles east of nowhere," Eli replied with a slight smile. "The Boone Ranch. You were passed out by Miller's Creek, or what's left of it this time of year." The woman's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where a thin gold chain disappeared beneath her dirt-stained shirt. "I need to go." "Not in your condition. When's the last time you had water, food?" She couldn't answer, which was answer enough. Eli nodded toward the kitchen. "I'll get you something. Don't try to get up yet. You're still shaky." In the kitchen, Eli filled a glass with cool water from the well and prepared a simple meal: eggs from his chickens, bread he'd baked 2 days ago, and honey from the hives Margaret had tended. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the woman's eyes, the way they held both strength and deep exhaustion. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, during those first months after Margaret's death. When he returned to the guest room, the woman was sitting up, examining a small leather bag she'd clutched, even in unconsciousness. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. "Sarah," she said quietly. "My name is Sarah." Eli set the tray on the bedside table. "Eli Boone. This is my ranch." Sarah picked up the water glass with both hands, drinking slowly. The simple act seemed to restore some color to her face. "Thank you. I'll be out of your way soon." "No hurry. Desert's not going anywhere." Over the next 3 days, Sarah remained mostly in the guest room, accepting Eli's care with reluctant gratitude. He brought her meals, checked on her recovery, and asked no questions about how she'd ended up alone in the desert. His quiet presence was both comforting and unsettling. He wasn't used to kindness without expectation. From her window, Sarah watched Eli go about his daily routines. He rose before dawn, tending to the horses in the corral, checking the water systems, maintaining the endless fences that kept his small world intact. There was a rhythm to his movements, a peace in his solitude that she envied. This was a man who had found his place in the world and needed nothing from it but the simple satisfaction of honest work. On the fourth morning, Sarah felt strong enough to venture outside. She found Eli in the barn, brushing down a paint mare whose coat gleamed in the filtered sunlight. The horse nickered softly as Sarah approached, and Eli looked up from his work. "How you feeling?" he asked. "Better. Stronger." Sarah ran her hand along the mare's neck. "She's beautiful. That's Sage. She's got a gentle heart, but she's been through some rough times. Found her wandering the desert 3 years ago, half dead and skittish as a jackrabbit. Took months before she'd let anyone near her." Sarah understood the parallel. "And now? Now she's home." Eli's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah heard the deeper meaning. Sometimes it just takes time to trust that you're safe. That afternoon, Pete Martinez arrived in his battered pickup truck, bringing supplies from town. Pete was 73, had known Eli since they were boys, and possessed the kind of frankness that came with decades of desert living. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said when he saw Sarah helping Eli stack hay bales. "Eli's got himself some company. Pete, this is Sarah. She's recovering from some travel troubles." Pete tipped his hat. "Mom, good to see someone bringing a little life back to this place. Eli's been rattling around here like a marble in a coffee can since Margaret passed." Sarah glanced at Eli, who was studiously avoiding her eyes. "Margaret was your wife?" 37 years, Pete answered when Eli didn't. "Finest woman God ever made. Cancer took her 5 years ago come October." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah finally asked the question that had been building in her chest. "Why did you help me?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "Margaret used to say that we're all just walking each other home. Some of us just take longer routes than others." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I was running away. I figured, from my husband, my marriage, my whole life." Eli nodded but didn't press for details. In the growing darkness, Sarah found herself talking about things she'd never said allowed the slow erosion of her identity. The way 25 years of marriage had somehow made her feel smaller rather than larger. She talked about the moment she'd finally loaded her car and driven west without a destination, burning through her savings and what little courage she possessed. "I don't know what I was looking for," she admitted. "I just knew I couldn't stay." "Sometimes that's enough," Eli said. "Sometimes you have to lose yourself before you can find yourself." As the stars emerged in the vast desert sky, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. The ranch was quiet, except for the distant sound of horses moving in the corral and the gentle whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. She was hundreds of miles from the life she'd abandoned, in the company of a man who asked nothing of her but her presence. But even as she began to feel safe, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring decisions. She couldn't stay here forever, living on the kindness of a stranger. Yet the thought of leaving filled her with a panic she couldn't name. She'd spent so long running from her past that she'd forgotten how to imagine a future. That night, lying in Margaret's guest room under the hand-stitched quilt, Sarah stared at the wooden cross on the mantel and wondered if she was brave enough to stop running. Outside her window, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, no longer a barrier, but a promise that sometimes the most important journeys begin when we finally stand still. Sarah woke before dawn on her 7th day at the ranch, her mind made up. She'd imposed on Eli's kindness long enough. Her strength had returned, her sunburn had faded to a light tan, and her car retrieved from where she'd abandoned it, near the creek, was running again thanks to Eli's mechanical skills. It was time to continue her journey west, though she still had no clear destination in mind. She dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, gathering the few belongings she'd carried into the desert. At the bottom of her small duffel bag, her fingers found the manila envelope that contained the remnants of her former LifeBank statements, insurance papers, and a single photograph that she'd been carrying since the day she left Phoenix. The photograph showed her and David on their 10th wedding anniversary, standing in front of their suburban home. They looked happy in the picture, or at least she had convinced herself they were happy. But now, studying David's possessive arm around her waist and her own forced smile, Sarah could see the cracks that had eventually split their marriage apart. On impulse, she decided to burn it. Outside, the desert air was cool and still. Sarah walked to the fire pit behind the house, where Eli sometimes grilled dinner or sat with his evening coffee. She struck a match and held it to the corner of the photograph, watching as the flames consumed first David's face, then her own. But as the fire ate through the image, something unexpected happened instead of relief. She felt a crushing wave of grief and panic. This wasn't just about David. This was about erasing herself, destroying the last evidence that she had ever existed at all. 25 years of marriage, good and bad, were disappearing into ash. She tried to stamp out the flames, but it was too late. The photograph crumbled to pieces in her hands. "No, no, no," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside the fire pit. What had she done? The photograph might have been a symbol of a failed marriage, but it was also proof that she had once been someone who had dreams and hopes and a place in the world, even if that place had become a prison. The tears came then, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She wept for the woman in the photograph, who had tried so hard to be enough, for the dreams she'd abandoned, for the way she'd let herself disappear so gradually that she hadn't noticed until it was almost too late. "Sarah?" She looked up to find Eli standing a few feet away, dressed in his work clothes and holding 2 cups of coffee. His face was creased with concern. "I was leaving," she said through her tears. "I was going to leave, and I thought if I burned the picture it would be easier." Eli set down the coffee cups and knelt beside her. "But it wasn't. It was the only picture I kept, the only proof that my marriage existed at all. And I know it was mostly bad toward the end, but there were good times too. And now," she held up the ashes, "now there's nothing." "Tell me about the good times," Eli said gently. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We used to dance in our kitchen on Sunday mornings. David would make pancakes and play old jazz records, and we'd dance while the coffee brewed. I felt so loved in those moments, so seen." "When did the dancing stop?" "I don't know. Gradually, I guess. David started working longer hours, getting promoted, making more money. I taught elementary school for the first 10 years, but when he got the vice presidency at his company, he said it didn't make sense for me to keep working, said I should focus on making a nice home for us." Eli picked up a charred fragment of the photograph. "And you gave up teaching?" "I wanted to make him happy. I thought if I could just be the perfect wife, if I could make everything at home smooth and beautiful, then he'd love me the way he used to." Sarah's voice grew bitter. "But it was never enough. The house was never clean enough. Dinner was never ready early enough. I wasn't social enough with his colleagues, wasn't quiet enough when he needed to work." "What was the final straw?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from the ashes. "I found out he'd been having an affair with his assistant, a woman 15 years younger than me." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. He said I'd become boring, that I'd let myself go, that I wasn't the woman he married anymore." "And what did you say?" "I said he was right. I wasn't the woman he married anymore. I was smaller, quieter, more afraid. I'd spent 15 years trying to be what he wanted instead of being myself." Sarah looked at Eli. "That's when I knew I had to leave. Not just the marriage, but everything. I needed to find out who I was without him." Eli nodded slowly. "That takes courage." "Does it? Because sometimes I think I'm just a coward who ran away instead of fighting for what I wanted." "You're here, aren't you? That's not running away, that's running toward something. But I don't know what I'm running toward. I have no plan, no destination. I sold our house, took half of everything, and just started driving west. I thought I'd know what I was looking for when I found it, but what if I never find it? What if I'm just a 50-year-old woman having a breakdown in the middle of the desert?" Eli stood and offered her his hand. "Come with me." He led her into the house, to his bedroom, where he opened the top drawer of an old wooden dresser. Inside were dozens of pictures of him and Margaret throughout their marriage, from their wedding day to their last Christmas together. "Margaret died of cancer," he said, picking up a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end. 8 months to say everything we needed to say, to hold each other through the fear, to find peace with what was coming." Sarah studied the photograph. Margaret looked like the kind of woman who would dance in her kitchen and tend beehives and offer comfort to lost souls. "I thought I'd never recover from losing her," Eli continued. "For 2 years after she died, I barely left this ranch. I had everything I needed here, the horses, the work, the memories. I convinced myself that was enough." "What changed?" "Time, and the realization that Margaret wouldn't want me to stop living just because she couldn't anymore." He put the photograph back in the drawer. "The day I found you by that creek bed, I'd been thinking about her, about how she always said we're supposed to help each other along the way." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. "You think she would have wanted you to help me?" "I think she would have wanted me to help anyone who needed it. But more than that, I think she would have wanted me to remember that loneliness isn't the same as peace, and isolation isn't the same as healing." They stood in the quiet bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of Eli's past love and the ashes of Sarah's burned bridges. Outside, the sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. "I was going to leave this morning," Sarah said softly. "I know, but I don't have anywhere to go. You could stay, for as long as you need." Sarah met his eyes, seeing in them a kindness that asked nothing in return. "Why would you want me to stay?" Eli was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Because this ranch is too big for one person, because there's work to be done that goes better with 2 sets of hands, and because maybe we're both tired of eating dinner alone." It wasn't a declaration of love or even attraction. It was something simpler and somehow more profound. It was an invitation to stop running, to plant her feet somewhere and see what grew. "I don't know how to do this," Sarah admitted. "I don't know how to start over." "Neither did I," Eli said. "But I've learned that sometimes you don't start over. You just start where you are, with what you have." Sarah nodded, decision crystallizing in her chest. "Okay. Okay, I'll stay, for now, until I figure out what comes next." Eli smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Good, because those fences need mending, and Margaret's vegetable garden has been overrun with weeds for 5 years. As they walked back outside together, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for any specific future, but for the simple possibility that she might be capable of building something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. The desert stretched endlessly around them, no longer a place of exile, but a canvas waiting for whatever she was brave enough to paint on it. The rhythm of ranch life began to weave itself into Sarah's days, like a gentle current carrying her forward. She woke each morning to the sound of Eli moving quietly through the house, starting coffee and checking the weather. By the time she dressed and joined him in the kitchen, he'd already been outside surveying his small kingdom, checking water levels, counting horses, and reading the sky for signs of change. "Sleep well?" became his daily greeting, delivered with the same steady kindness that marked everything he did. Sarah found herself looking forward to these morning moments, sharing coffee and simple breakfast while planning the day's work. There was something healing in the predictability of it, the way each day held purpose without urgency. On her second week at the ranch, Eli surprised her by bringing out a leather-bound journal during their evening coffee. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and pressed flowers were visible between some of the pages. "This was Margaret's," he said, placing it gently on the porch table between them. "She documented everything that grew on this land, wildflowers, herbs, the trees she planted, every season for 30 years. Sarah opened the journal carefully, immediately struck by the delicate beauty of Margaret's handwriting. Each page was a work of art-pressed flowers and leaves, accompanied by detailed notes about growing conditions, blooming times, and the creatures that depended on each plant. "Look at this," Sarah breathed, studying a page devoted to desert marigolds. Margaret had noted not only when they bloomed, but how their golden petals provided food for butterflies and their seeds sustained quail through the winter. "She saw connections everywhere," Eli said quietly. "How everything depended on everything else. I used to tease her about talking to her plants, but they grew better for her than anyone else." Sarah turned another page and found an entry about the cottonwood trees that sheltered the ranch. Margaret had written, "Planted these with such hope today. E says, I'm crazy to think they'll survive out here, but I know they will. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the hardest places." She planted the cottonwoods. "First year we were married. I thought she was out of her mind. Cottonwoods need water, and we're in the middle of the desert." But she researched the water table, found the right spot, and babied those saplings through 3 years of drought. Eli's voice held deep admiration. "Now they're the reason this place feels like home, instead of just a patch of dirt." Sarah continued reading, drawn into Margaret's world of careful observation and patient nurturing. Here was a woman who understood that growth required both vision and persistence, who could see potential in barren ground. "Why are you showing me this?" Sarah asked. Eli was quiet for a moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Because you remind me of her, not in looks, but in the way you see things. Yesterday I watched you spend 20 minutes observing that injured hawk in the south pasture, figuring out how to help without scaring it away. Margaret would have done the same thing." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. It had been so long since anyone had seen qualities in her worth comparing to someone else's strengths. Over the following days, Sarah found herself carrying Margaret's journal as she worked around the ranch. She discovered that many of the plants Margaret had catalogued still grew wild across the property: desert sage, brittlebush, fairy duster, and dozens of others she'd never learned to identify. Using the journal as a guide, Sarah began to see the ranch as Margaret had seen it, not as empty desert, but as a complex ecosystem where every plant and creature had its place. The work itself became a meditation, repairing fence posts in the morning sun, her hands learning the weight of tools and the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. Cleaning water troughs and checking their levels, understanding for the first time how precious and carefully managed water was in this landscape. Feeding the horses and learning their individual personalities: gentle sage, spirited thunder, ancient wise-eyed buck, who'd been Eli's companion for over 20 years. "You're a natural with them," Eli observed one afternoon as Sarah successfully coaxed Thunder, the most skittish of the horses, to accept a halter. "I used to ride when I was young," Sarah said, running her hand along Thunder's neck. "Before I got married, before I convinced myself I didn't have time for things I enjoyed." "What else did you used to enjoy?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd spent so many years defining herself by what David needed, what the house required, what social obligations demanded, that she'd forgotten to ask herself what brought her joy. "Teaching," she said finally. "I loved working with children, seeing them discover something new. I taught 3rd grade, and there's this magical moment when reading finally clicks for a struggling student, or when a shy child finds the courage to speak up in class." "You could teach again." "Could I? I've been out of the classroom for 15 years. Education has probably changed completely." "The fundamentals don't change," Eli said. "Kids still need someone who believes in them." That evening, Sarah found herself thinking about teaching while she helped Eli prepare dinner. They'd fallen into an easy domestic routine. He handled the main cooking while she prepared vegetables and set the table. It was partnership rather than service, both of them contributing their skills to create something better than either could manage alone. "Eli," she said as they sat down to eat, "what was your life like before Margaret?" "Lonelier," he said simply. "I was a county sheriff for 30 years, and it's work that shows you mostly the worst in people. Margaret helped me remember that there was good in the world worth protecting." "How did you meet her?" A smile crossed Eli's weathered face. She was a schoolteacher in town. I got called to her classroom one day because of a disturbance. Turned out one of her students was acting out because his father was beating him. Margaret had figured it out and called for help, but she was terrified the boy would get in more trouble. What happened? I arrested the father and made sure the boy got into a safe home. But what struck me was how fierce Margaret was in protecting that child, and how gentle she was with him afterward. She had this way of being strong and soft at the same time. Sarah understood. She could see that same quality in Elitha, gentle strength that had carried her from the desert, that asked nothing while offering everything. She sounds wonderful. She was. But she's gone, and I'm still here. Eli met Sarah's eyes across the table. For a long time I thought that meant I was supposed to just maintain what we'd built together, keep everything exactly as she'd left it. But lately I've been thinking maybe she'd want me to keep building. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, recognizing the shift in their relationship, even as both of them remained carefully within safe boundaries. After dinner, they walked to the corral where the horses were settling for the night. The desert air was cooling, and stars were beginning to emerge in the vast sky. Sarah leaned against the fence rail, watching Thunder and Sage graze peacefully side by side. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she admitted quietly. "What do you mean?" "This feels too good to be real, too peaceful, too safe. I keep thinking something's going to go wrong, or you're going to realize what a burden I am, or—" "Sarah." Eli's voice was firm but kind. "You're not a burden. You're help I didn't know I needed." She turned to look at him, this man who had somehow seen worth in her when she couldn't see it in herself. In the growing darkness, she was struck by how handsome he was, not in the polished way David had been handsome, but in the way of someone whose character had been carved by weather and work and loss into something genuinely strong. "I don't know how to do this," she said softly. "Do what?" "Trust that something good might actually last." Eli nodded slowly. "Neither do I, but maybe we can figure it out together." As they walked back to the house under the brilliant desert stars, Sarah realized that somewhere in the past 2 weeks she'd stopped thinking about leaving. The ranch was beginning to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a place where she might actually belong. It was a dangerous thought, one that made her vulnerable in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she looked at the man walking beside her, solid and patient and kind, she thought maybe, just maybe, she was brave enough to try. The morning Sarah proved herself with the horses marked a turning point neither of them had expected. It started with Thunder breaking loose from the corral, something that happened occasionally when the spirited gelding decided the grass looked greener beyond the fence. Usually it took Eli the better part of an hour to coax the horse back, and sometimes he had to use the truck to herd Thunder home. But when Sarah saw Thunder galloping toward the open desert, something instinctive kicked in. Without hesitation, she grabbed a lead rope and walked steadily toward the escaping horse, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't chase or call out. Instead, she positioned herself between Thunder and the desert, then simply stood still and waited. Eli watched from the barn, torn between calling out warnings and trusting Sarah's judgment. Thunder slowed as he approached her, then stopped entirely, his ears forward with curiosity rather than fear. Sarah extended her hand, letting him catch her scent, then gently slipped the lead rope around his neck. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice carrying the same quiet authority Eli had heard from the best horse handlers. "Let's go home." Thunder followed her back to the corral without resistance, as if he'd simply been testing whether anyone understood his language. "Where did that come from?" Eli asked, as Sarah secured the gate. "I don't know," Sarah said, looking as surprised as he was. "I just knew what to do." It was then that Eli showed her the set of hand-forged horseshoes hanging in the barn shoes he'd made himself in the small forge behind the workshop. Each shoe was perfectly balanced, shaped with the kind of precision that came from decades of practice and an understanding of how horses moved. "My grandfather taught me to shoe horses when I was 12, Eli explained, running his thumb along the smooth curve of iron. said a man who understood horses, understood something essential about life, that trust and patience were worth more than force. Sarah picked up one of the shoes, feeling its weight and admiring the craftsmanship. "You made these?" "Every horse on this ranch wears shoes I forged. It's slow work, but when you do it right, the horse moves better, stays sound longer." He paused, watching her examine his work. "There's something honest about working with your hands, creating something useful that'll last." "David always said handwork was for people who couldn't do anything else," Sarah said, then immediately looked embarrassed by the admission. "David sounds like a fool." The blunt statement surprised a laugh out of Sarah. "He has an MBA from Wharton, runs a consulting firm, and I bet he's never made anything that'll outlast him," Eli said simply. "These shoes will protect horses long after I'm gone. That's worth something." Sarah nodded, understanding something profound in his words. There was dignity in creating things that mattered, in work that served others, rather than just accumulating wealth. Over the following week, Sarah threw herself into learning every aspect of ranch life. She helped Eli repair a section of fence damaged by a flash flood, her hands learning to twist wire and set posts. She cleaned and organized the tack room, discovering equipment that hadn't been properly maintained since Margaret's death. She even convinced Eli to let her help with the evening feeding, though he worried the horses might spook with someone new handling their grain. They didn't spook. If anything, the horses seemed to respond to Sarah's quiet confidence with increased gentleness. Even Buck, the ancient gelding who barely tolerated anyone but Eli, allowed Sarah to brush his coat and clean his hooves. "You've got a gift," Eli told her one evening as they watched the horses settle for the night. "Or maybe I just needed to remember who I used to be." The comment hung between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah was changing, not becoming someone new, but rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of trying to be what someone else wanted. The shift became even more apparent the day Eli found her reading to the horses. He'd gone to the corral looking for a specific piece of equipment and discovered Sarah sitting on the fence rail with an old book open in her lap, reading aloud to the gathered animals. The secret garden was not open. It was the sweetest, most mysterious-looking place anyone could imagine, she read, her teacher's voice carrying clearly in the desert air. All 5 horses stood near the fence, ears forward, as if actually listening to the story. Eli found himself listening too, drawn by the warmth and expression in Sarah's voice. When she finished the chapter and looked up to find him watching, she blushed. "I know it's silly, but I found this book in the house, and they seem to like the sound of it." "Margaret used to read to them too," Eli said. "Different books, but the same idea. She said it gentled them." "Did you think she was crazy?" "At first, but then I noticed they were calmer on the days she read to them, easier to handle." He climbed up to sit beside her on the fence rail. "What made you think to try it?" "I missed teaching," Sarah said simply. "I missed having an audience that wanted to learn something from me, even if they're horses." That evening brought unexpected visitors when Pete Martinez arrived with his granddaughter Rosa, a shy 8-year-old who was spending the summer with him while her parents worked out custody arrangements. Rosa hung back behind Pete's legs, overwhelmed by the vast ranch and the tall, quiet strangers. "Rosa's been having a hard time," Pete explained quietly to Eli and Sarah while the little girl explored the porch. "Her parents' divorce has been ugly, and she stopped talking much. Doctor says she just needs time and stability." Sarah watched Rosa examine a potted cactus on the porch steps, noting how carefully the child touched the plant's spines without causing harm. There was something in the girl's focused attention that reminded Sarah of her former students, the ones who needed extra patience and understanding. "Would she like to meet the horses?" Sarah asked. Rosa's head came up immediately, dark eyes wide with interest. "Can I?" It was the first thing she'd said since arriving. At the corral, Sarah introduced Rosa to each horse individually, explaining their personalities and letting the girl offer them handfuls of hay. When gentle Sage nuzzled Rosa's palm looking for treats, the little girl giggled a sound that made both men smile. "She likes you," Sarah told Rosa. Sage is very particular about her friends. Can I ride her? Maybe someday, when you've learned how to ask her properly. How do you ask a horse? Sarah spent the next 20 minutes explaining how horses communicated through body language, how to approach them safely, and how riding was a partnership rather than control. Rosa absorbed every word, with the intensity only children could bring to subjects that captured their imagination. "You're a natural teacher," Eli observed as they watched Rosa carefully brush Sage's neck under Sarah's guidance. "I'd forgotten how much I missed it." When Pete and Rosa left that evening, Rosa extracted a promise from Sarah that she could come back soon to continue learning about horses. After they drove away, Sarah and Eli sat on the porch, sharing a quiet beer and watching the sun set over the desert. "She reminds me of some of my students," Sarah said. "The ones who were dealing with too much at home but could still find wonder in small things. You should think about teaching again." "Here? There probably isn't even a school within 50 miles. There's always a need for good teachers, and after seeing you with Rosa today, I think you're exactly the kind of teacher some kids need." Sarah considered this, imagining herself in a classroom again after 15 years away. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. "I don't know if I remember how. Some things you don't forget. They're just waiting for the right moment to come back." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of old fears, a tentative willingness to imagine a future that looked nothing like her past. The ranch that had started as a temporary refuge was becoming something else, a place where she could rebuild not just her strength, but her sense of purpose. She glanced at Eli, this man who seemed to understand her better than she understood herself, and wondered if he was feeling the same quiet transformation. The careful distance they'd maintained was becoming harder to justify, the attraction between them more difficult to ignore. But for tonight, it was enough to sit beside him in comfortable silence, two people who had found something unexpected in the middle of nowhere, the possibility of beginning again. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Sarah was gathering eggs from the henhouse. She heard the landline ringing in the kitchen and ignored it. Few people called the ranch, and Eli was better equipped to handle business calls. But when the ringing stopped and started again immediately, she hurried inside, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Boone Ranch," she answered, using the greeting she'd heard Eli use. "Well, well, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison." The voice hit her like a physical blow. David. Her ex-husband's tone carried that familiar mixture of charm and condescension that had once made her question her own perceptions of reality. "How did you find me?" The words came out as a whisper. "Did you really think you could just disappear? I'm not some backwoods sheriff, sweetheart. I have resources." David's voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone he used when he wanted to seem like the rational one. "Now, I think we've let this little tantrum go on long enough. It's time to come home." Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. "I'm not coming home, David. We're divorced." "Actually, we're not. Funny thing about divorce papers, they have to be properly filed to be valid, and it seems there were some irregularities with the paperwork you filed. Your lawyer was very apologetic about the mix-up." The kitchen seemed to tilt around Sarah. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you're still my wife, legally speaking, which means you don't get to run off to the middle of nowhere and play cowgirl with some broken-down rancher." The pleasant facade cracked slightly, showing the steel underneath. "I've been patient, Sarah. I've let you have your little adventure, but now you're embarrassing me, and that stops today." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "The divorce was final. I have the papers." "You have papers your incompetent lawyer thought were final. But without proper filing and my signature on the amended documents, you're still Mrs. David Morrison, and Mrs. David Morrison belongs at home, not shacked up with some desert rat. You can't. This isn't legal. You can't just..." "Can't what?" "Exercise my rights as your husband. Expect my wife to stop making a fool of herself and come home where she belongs." David's voice turned gentle again, the shift so sudden it made Sarah's head spin. "Look, sweetheart, I know you're confused right now. This whole midlife crisis thing happens to lots of women your age, but I'm willing to forgive and forget if you come home today. We can work through this together, like we always have. Sarah felt the familiar fog of self-doubt creeping in, the way David had always made her question her own judgment. But then she heard Eli's truck pulling into the yard, and the sound anchored her to the present moment, to the life she'd been building, the woman she'd been becoming. "No," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not coming home, David. I'm not your wife anymore, regardless of what some paperwork says. I left you, I left that life, and I'm not going back." The silence on the other end stretched so long, Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. When David spoke again, his voice had shed all pretense of warmth. "You will come home, Sarah. One way or another. I've built a life, a reputation, a business that depends on stability and respectability. I won't let you destroy that because you're having some pathetic breakdown. And if I refuse, then I'll come get you. And when I do, you'll discover that the law has ways of dealing with wives who abandon their families and refuse psychiatric help." The threat was carefully crafted, vague enough to be legal, specific enough to terrify. Sarah knew David well enough to understand he'd already researched exactly how to manipulate the system to get what he wanted. The kitchen door opened, and Eli stepped inside, immediately sensing something wrong. Sarah's face was pale, her hand still gripping the phone like a lifeline. "I have to go," she said into the receiver. 24 hours, Sarah. After that, I stopped being understanding." The line went dead. Sarah set the phone down with exaggerated care, as if it might explode. "What's wrong?" Eli asked, crossing to her in 2 quick strides. "That was David, my ex-husband." Sarah's voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. "He says we're not actually divorced, some problem with the paperwork." Eli pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "What kind of problem?" Sarah explained the call, watching Eli's expression grow darker with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the table. "He threatened you," Eli said finally. "He threatened to have me committed, said I was having a breakdown, abandoning my family." Sarah touched the thin gold chain at her throat, where her wedding ring still hung like a millstone. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just a crazy woman having a midlife crisis." "Sarah," Eli's voice was firm. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, finding steady strength there. "You are the sanest person I know. You're not having a breakdown, you're having a breakthrough. There's a difference." "But what if he's right about the divorce? What if I'm still legally married to him?" "Then we'll fix it. There are lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing, people who know how to deal with men like your ex-husband." "You don't understand," Sarah said, panic rising in her chest. "David doesn't make empty threats. If he says he can force me to come back, he probably can. He has money, connections, lawyers who know how to make problems disappear." Eli reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Then we'll make sure you have the same resources." "I can't afford that kind of legal help." "I can." Sarah stared at him. "Eli, no. I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to help someone I care about." The simple declaration hung between them, carrying weight beyond the immediate crisis. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear this time, but from gratitude for this man who stood ready to fight battles that weren't his own. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you're worth fighting for, because what we've built here matters, and because I'll be damned if I let some bully take away the first real happiness I've felt in 5 years." That afternoon, Eli made calls while Sarah tried to work in Margaret's garden, needing the comfort of growing things. But her hands shook as she pulled weeds, and she kept looking toward the road, expecting to see David's silver Mercedes appearing in a cloud of dust. The ring on the chain around her neck felt heavier with each passing hour. She'd kept wearing it out of habit, but now it felt like a shackle, physical proof of David's continued claim on her life. As the sun began to set, she finally pulled the chain over her head, and stared at the simple gold band that had once symbolized love and partnership. Now it represented only obligation and fear. When Eli found her sitting on the porch steps, the ring and chain pooled in her palm, he sat beside her without speaking. The desert stretched endlessly before them, painted in shades of gold and purple by the setting sun. "I called a lawyer in Phoenix," he said finally. "Friend of mine from my sheriff days. He says David's probably bluffing about the divorce not being final, but we'll need to check the paperwork to be sure. And if he's not bluffing, then we file new papers, properly this time, with representation that can't be intimidated." Sarah nodded, still staring at the ring in her palm. "He used to say I was nothing without him, that I'd never survive on my own. And what do you say now?" Sarah thought about the past month, the work she'd learned, the confidence she'd regained, the peace she'd found in this quiet place. She thought about Rosa's laughter when the horses nuzzled her hands, about the satisfaction of mending fences and gathering eggs, about the way Eli looked at her like she was capable of anything. "I say he was wrong," she said quietly. "I'm not nothing. I'm not weak, and I'm not going back to being the woman who believed his lies." She stood and walked to the fire pit where she'd burned David's photograph weeks ago. This time, when she lit the match and held it to the gold chain, her hands were steady. The chain caught fire quickly, the metal growing too hot to hold. She dropped it into the ashes and watched it burn. The ring itself wouldn't burn, but Sarah picked up a hammer from Eli's workshop and brought it down on the gold band again and again until it was nothing but flattened metal, unrecognizable as anything that had once bound her to another person. "Feel better?" Eli asked when she returned to the porch, slightly out of breath from the effort. "Getting there," Sarah said. And for the first time since the phone rang that morning, she meant it. The days following David's phone call passed in a strange suspension of time. Sarah threw herself into ranch work with renewed intensity, as if staying busy could keep her fears at bay. Eli watched her carefully, noting the way she startled at unexpected sounds and how her eyes tracked toward the road whenever a vehicle passed in the distance. On the third morning, he made a decision. After their usual breakfast, instead of heading out to check the fence lines, he led Sarah to his workshop behind the barn. The space was filled with the tools of his various crafts, blacksmith equipment, woodworking benches, and shelves lined with projects in various stages of completion. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling a cloth-covered object from a high shelf. When he unwrapped it, Sarah drew in a sharp breath. It was a wooden horse, carved with exquisite detail from what looked like desert oak. Every muscle and sinew was perfectly rendered, the mane seeming to flow with captured motion. The craftsmanship was museum quality, the kind of art that took months to complete. "Eli, this is beautiful. Did you make this?" "Started it, the winter, after Margaret died," he said, turning the carving in his hands. "Took me 2 years to finish. I'd work on it in the evenings when the house felt too quiet." Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the hours of patient work that had gone into every curve. "What made you think to carve a horse?" "Margaret always said horses were the most honest creatures on earth. No pretense, no deception, just pure instinct and loyalty." He paused, looking at the carving with something approaching reverence. "I wanted to create something that captured that honesty. It's incredible. You should sell these. People would pay thousands for work like this." Eli shook his head. "I don't make them to sell. I make them because the work itself matters." He met her eyes. "I want you to have this one." Sarah's hands stilled on the wooden horse. "Eli, I can't. This must have taken 2 years, 3 months, and about 100 evenings," he said with a slight smile. "Margaret used to tease me about talking to my carvings while I worked on them, said I was having conversations with the wood." "Were you?" "In a way. There's something about working with your hands that clears your mind, lets you think through problems without forcing them." He wrapped the carving back in its cloth. "I want you to have it because it represents something important, the patience to see a project through, even when you can't see how it's going to turn out." Sarah accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of it felt significant, like a promise or a talisman. "Thank you." But why now? Because I've been watching you these past few days, and I can see you're preparing to run again. And I want you to remember that some things are worth staying to fight for. The truth of his observation hit her like a physical blow. She had been preparing to run, making mental inventories of her belongings, calculating how far her remaining money might take her, planning escape routes that would make her harder to find. He scared me, she admitted quietly. He meant to. Men like David use fear as a weapon because they know it's effective. Eli's voice carried the weight of his years as a sheriff. But fear only works if you let it make your decisions for you. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when a dusty pickup truck pulled into the yard. Sarah tensed, but relaxed when she recognized Pete Martinez climbing out of the cab. He wasn't alone. Rosa was with him, and she ran toward the corral the moment her feet hit the ground. Thought Rosa might like to see how Sage is doing, Pete said, but his eyes were serious as they moved between Sarah and Eli. Also thought you might like to know there's been a stranger in town asking questions about you, Sarah. Sarah's blood went cold. What kind of stranger? City type, expensive suit, fancy car, showed up at the diner yesterday, flashing around a picture of you and asking if anyone had seen you. Pete's weathered face was grim. Maisie told him she'd never seen you before in her life. Did he believe her? Hard to say, but he's still in town, staying at the motel. Word is he's hired Jimmy Crawford to do some scouting. Eli's jaw tightened. Jimmy Crawford was a local man with a reputation for doing questionable work for anyone willing to pay cash. If David had hired him, it meant he was serious about finding Sarah and willing to use local knowledge to do it. How long before he finds this place? Sarah asked. Jimmy knows every ranch in 3 counties, Pete said bluntly. If he's looking, he'll find you within a day or 2. Sarah felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. I have to leave. If David finds me here, he'll cause trouble for all of you. Like hell you're leaving, Eli said firmly. This is your home now, and no one's driving you away from it. Eli's right, Pete said, surprising them both. I've known men like your ex-husband, Sarah. They're bullies who count on people being too scared or isolated to stand up to them. But this is our community, and we protect our own. You barely know me. I know enough, Pete said. I know Eli's been happier these past few weeks than I've seen him since Margaret died. I know you've been good for this place and good for him. And I know Rosa hasn't stopped talking about the lady who's teaching her about horses. As if summoned by her name, Rosa appeared at Sarah's elbow, her small face serious. Are you in trouble? Sarah knelt to the girl's level, choosing her words carefully. Someone from my old life is trying to make me go back to a place where I wasn't happy. But Eli and your grandpa are helping me figure out how to stay here. Good, Rosa said with 8-year-old certainty. You belong here. The horses like you, and you make Eli smile. Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in the child's voice. That evening, after Pete and Rosa had gone home, Sarah and Eli sat on the porch as they had every night for weeks. But tonight felt different, charged with the awareness that their peaceful routine might soon be shattered. Tell me about Margaret, Sarah said, needing to understand the depth of what Eli was risking by helping her. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in his hands. She was the strongest person I ever knew, but she carried it lightly. Never made anyone feel small for being different or struggling with something she found easy. How did you know you loved her? The day I realized I wanted to be a better man because of her, not for her. He glanced at Sarah. There's a difference. One is about changing yourself to please someone else. The other is about becoming who you were meant to be because they see that person in you. Sarah understood. In the weeks since arriving at the ranch, she'd become someone she'd forgotten. She could be capable, confident, worthy of respect and care. Not because Eli demanded it, but because he'd created space for her to grow into herself again. David never saw who I really was, she said quietly. He saw who he wanted me to be, and when I couldn't be that person anymore, he tried to force me back into that shape. And now, Sarah thought about the wooden horse wrapped carefully in her room, about the satisfaction of work well done, and the peace of morning coffee shared with someone who valued her thoughts. She thought about Rosa's laughter and Pete's fierce protection and the way the horses had come to trust her hands. "Now I know the difference between being loved and being possessed," she said. Eli nodded slowly. Margaret used to say that love was about helping someone become more themselves, not less. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the horses stirred restlessly in the corral. The desert night was full of sounds and movements, invisible to city dwellers, but Sarah had learned to read the subtle language of this place. "Whatever happens," Eli said finally, "I want you to know that these weeks have been a gift. You've brought this place back to life. Even if David manages to—" "No," Eli's voice was firm. "I won't let him take you. I've lost one woman I loved, to circumstances beyond my control. I won't lose another to a man who doesn't deserve her." The declaration hung between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Sarah felt her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from hope, the dangerous, wonderful hope, that maybe she'd found not just a refuge, but a real home. "I love you too," she said quietly, the words emerging without conscious thought. Eli turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Even knowing what we might be facing," especially knowing that. Sarah reached for his hand, feeling the calluses earned through decades of honest work. "For the first time in my life, I'm with someone who makes me want to fight rather than run." When Eli kissed her, it was with the careful reverence of a man who understood the value of what he held. Sarah kissed him back, tasting coffee and possibility and the promise of a future worth fighting for. Tomorrow might bring confrontation and complications, but tonight was theirs, two people who had found each other in the middle of nowhere and discovered that nowhere could be exactly where they belonged. Sarah was mucking out Sage's stall when the expensive black sedan pulled into the ranch yard. She heard the engine first too, smooth, too quiet for the rough desert road sand, knew without looking that her time of peace was over. Through the barn's open door, she watched David emerge from the driver's seat, looking exactly as she remembered, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of casual authority that came from never being told no. He wasn't alone. A woman in a business suit climbed out of the passenger side, tall, blonde, and young enough to be Sarah's daughter. The assistant, Sarah realized with a bitter twist in her stomach. The woman David had chosen to replace her. "Sarah Elizabeth," David called out, his voice carrying the forced joviality he used when he wanted to appear reasonable to witnesses. "There you are, sweetheart. You've led us quite a chase." Sarah set down the pitchfork and walked slowly toward the barn door, her heart hammering but her steps steady. Behind David and his companion, she could see Eli emerging from the workshop, his posture alert and ready. "Hello, David," she said, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "Is that any way to greet your husband?" David's smile was sharp around the edges. "I've come all this way to bring you home. I'm home." David's gaze swept dismissively over the ranch, the modest house, the weathered outbuildings, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. "This? Sarah? Be serious. This is a hovel in the middle of nowhere. You belong in Phoenix, in our house, with our life." "Your life," Sarah corrected. "It was never our life. It was your life, and I was just an accessory." "Now you're being dramatic." David's tone turned patronizing, the way it always did when he was preparing to explain why her feelings were wrong. "I know you've been going through a difficult time. The only difficult time I've had was being married to you." David's mask slipped for just a moment, showing the anger beneath. But then the blonde woman touched his arm, and he composed himself again. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Amanda," he said smoothly. "My assistant. She's been helping me track you down." Amanda stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband has been so worried about you. We all have." Sarah almost laughed at the audacity of it. Here was the woman David had been sleeping with, pretending concern for the wife she'd helped betray. "I'm sure you have." "Sarah." David's voice took on the reasonable tone that used to make her question her own sanity. "I know you're upset about the Amanda situation, but we can work through that. Couples therapy, whatever you need. The important thing is that you come home and we put this whole episode behind us." "Episode?" Sarah felt her composure crack slightly. "You call finding out about your affair an episode?" "I call running away to play house with some broken-down cowboy an episode," David snapped, his careful facade finally slipping. "And it ends today." Eli had been moving closer during the conversation, and now he stepped up beside Sarah. "I think the lady's made her position clear." David looked Eli up and down with undisguised contempt. "And you must be the broken-down cowboy. Tell me, do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble you're in for harboring another man's wife?" "Sarah's not your wife anymore," Eli said calmly. "Actually, she is." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. Turns out there were some irregularities with the divorce proceedings. Sarah's former lawyer was very apologetic about the mix-up. Sarah's blood went cold as David extracted a legal document from the envelope. Even from a distance, she could see official seals and signatures. "What is that?" "A restraining order," David said with satisfaction, "and a court order requiring you to return home for psychiatric evaluation. Apparently, abandoning your family and shacking up with strangers in the desert is considered evidence of mental instability." Sarah snatched the papers from his hands, scanning the legal language with growing horror. The documents looked official, complete with a judge's signature ordering her to return to Phoenix for evaluation and treatment. "This is insane," she breathed. "I'm not mentally ill. That's for qualified professionals to determine," Amanda said smoothly. "Dr. Hensley is one of the most respected psychiatrists in Arizona. He'll help you work through whatever crisis you're experiencing." Sarah knew Dr. Hensley had been David's golf partner for years. The fix was in before she'd ever walked into his office. "You can't do this," Eli said, his voice deadly quiet. "Actually, I can." David's smile was triumphant. "Arizona law is very clear about the responsibilities of family members when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis. As Sarah's husband, I have both the right and the obligation to ensure she gets the help she needs." "The divorce was final," Sarah said desperately. "I have the papers." "You have papers your incompetent lawyer thought were final. But without proper notice to all parties and my consent to the settlement terms, the divorce was never legally valid." David's voice turned gentle again, the shift making Sarah's skin crawl. "I know this is confusing, sweetheart, but that's why you need professional help. Your judgment hasn't been sound lately." Sarah felt the familiar fog of self-doubt creeping in, the way David had always made reality seem negotiable. But then she felt Eli's hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring, and the fog cleared. "No," she said firmly, "I won't go with you." "You don't have a choice," David said, pulling out his phone. "I have a private transport team on standby. They're licensed to handle psychiatric emergencies." "You mean kidnappers," Eli said. "I mean medical professionals who specialize in helping people who can't make rational decisions for themselves." David's finger hovered over his phone. "Now, Sarah, you can come with me voluntarily, and we'll handle this quietly, or I can make the call, and we'll do this the hard way. Your choice." Sarah looked at the legal documents in her hands, at David's confident smirk, at Amanda's false sympathy. Everything she'd built over the past month, her confidence, her sense of self, her growing love for Eli hung in the balance. "There's a third option," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Pete Martinez walking toward them, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came Sheriff Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. Pete must have called her when he saw the sedan arrive. "Sheriff Santos," David said smoothly, shifting into his most charming mode. "Thank goodness you're here. I'm David Morrison, and I'm trying to get help for my wife, who's been experiencing some mental health issues." "So I heard," Sheriff Santos said dryly. She looked at the papers in Sarah's hands. "Mind if I take a look at those?" Sarah handed over the documents, watching the sheriff's expression grow increasingly skeptical as she read. "Interesting," Sheriff Santos said finally. Because according to the Arizona court records I just checked, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison was granted a final divorce decree 6 weeks ago. Case number DV 2024-8847. David's face went pale. That's impossible. My lawyers said. Your lawyers lied, Sheriff Santos said bluntly. These documents you're carrying are forgeries. Pretty good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. She looked at Amanda. You might want to distance yourself from Mr. Morrison here, miss. Fraudulent court documents are a federal crime. Amanda took a step back, her face going white. David, you said this was all legal. It is legal, David sputtered, but his confidence was cracking. There were irregularities. The only irregularity here is you showing up on private property with fake legal documents to harass a divorced woman, Sheriff Santos said, which, by the way, constitutes stalking under Arizona law. Sarah felt something break free in her chest, a weight she'd been carrying for so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. The divorce is real? She asked. Real as rain, Sheriff Santos confirmed. You've been a free woman for 6 weeks, Mrs. Morrison, or should I say, Miss Turner. She smiled at Sarah's surprised look. Yes, I checked. You legally resumed your maiden name as part of the divorce decree. David was frantically dialing his phone now, probably calling his lawyers, but Sarah was no longer listening to his desperate attempts to regain control. She was looking at Eli, seeing pride and relief and love shining in his eyes. Miss Turner, Sheriff Santos continued, I need to ask if you want to press charges for harassment, stalking and fraud. Sarah looked at David, really looked at him, and saw not the powerful man who had controlled her life for 25 years, but a middle-aged bully whose primary weapon was other people's fear. Without that fear, he was nothing. Yes, she said clearly, I want to press charges. David's face transformed with rage. You can't do this to me, Sarah. I'll destroy you. I'll make sure you never work again, never have anything. That's enough, Sheriff Santos said sharply. David Morrison, you're under arrest for harassment, stalking, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As the sheriff read David his rights, Amanda backed toward the sedan, clearly planning to flee the scene. But Pete was blocking her path, his weathered face set in grim satisfaction. You might want to stick around, miss, he said mildly. Sheriff's going to want to talk to you about your part in this little scheme. Sarah watched David being handcuffed, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, complete, overwhelming relief. The man who had controlled her thoughts, her choices, her very sense of reality, was being led away in handcuffs, powerless to hurt her anymore. How did you know? She asked Sheriff Santos. Pete called me yesterday when he heard about the stranger in town asking questions. I did some checking, found out about your divorce, and figured something was fishy when this guy showed up with his story. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. I've seen men like him before. They count on people being too scared or isolated to check their facts. As the police car pulled away with David in the back seat, Sarah felt Eli's arms come around her from behind. She leaned back against his solid chest, watching the dust settle in the ranch yard. Is it really over? She whispered. It's really over, Eli confirmed, his voice warm against her ear. You're free, Sarah Turner, completely free. For the first time in 25 years, Sarah truly believed it. The silence that followed the police car's departure was profound, not empty, but full of possibilities. Sarah stood in Eli's arms for a long moment, letting the reality of her freedom sink into her bones. David was gone, the threat he represented neutralized by truth and the protection of people who cared about her. Well, Pete said finally, breaking the quiet, that was more excitement than we usually get around here. Sheriff Santos was finishing her notes when Amanda, who had been sitting in the sedan looking shell-shocked, finally approached them. Her perfectly composed facade had cracked, revealing a young woman who was clearly in over her head. I need to tell you something, Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. About the documents David brought. What about them? Sheriff Santos asked. He had them made. There's a man in Phoenix who specializes in creating paperwork for people who need it. David paid him $10,000 for those documents. Amanda's hands were shaking now. I thought it was just for negotiation purposes, to scare Sarah into coming back. I didn't know he was going to use them to actually try to kidnap her. Sarah stared at the young woman who had helped destroy her marriage. Why are you telling us this? Because what he did today, what he tried to do to you, it's not who I thought he was. Amanda's voice broke slightly. I believed him when he said you were having a breakdown, that you needed help. But seeing him today, seeing how he tried to manipulate the law to get what he wanted, I can't be part of that. Sheriff Santos made more notes. I'll need you to come to the station and give a formal statement about the forged documents. That testimony will be crucial for the prosecution. After Amanda left with the sheriff and Pete had gone home with promises to check on them later, Sarah and Eli found themselves alone on the ranch for the first time since the crisis began. The afternoon sun was starting its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. I can't believe it's over, Sarah said as they walked toward the house. Are you disappointed that you didn't get to use this? Eli asked, gesturing toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace as they entered the living room. Sarah looked at the weapon, her grandfather's hunting rifle, Eli had told her, passed down through 3 generations of Boone men. It represented protection, heritage, and the capacity for violence in defense of what mattered. For weeks, she'd been aware of its presence, a silent guardian watching over their domestic life. I'm glad we didn't need it, she said honestly, but I'm grateful it was there if we had. Eli nodded, understanding the distinction. Sometimes just knowing you're prepared to fight is enough to avoid having to actually fight. That evening brought a steady stream of visitors as word spread through their small community. Pete returned with Rosa, who presented Sarah with a drawing of her and Eli standing beside the horses. The local pastor and his wife stopped by with a casserole and offers of support. Even Maisie from the diner drove out with coffee and pie, declaring that anyone who stood up to bullies deserved home-baked celebration. You know what this means, Pete said as the informal gathering began to wind down. You're officially part of the community now. Can't get rid of us even if you wanted to. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the acceptance in his voice. I wouldn't want to. After everyone had gone home, Sarah and Eli sat on the porch in their customary spots. But everything felt different now. The careful distance they'd maintained was no longer necessary. The uncertainty about her legal status had been resolved. For the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, Sarah could think about the future without fear clouding her vision. What happens now? She asked. Eli was quiet for a moment, his coffee cup warming his hands in the cooling desert air. I guess that depends on what you want to happen. I want to stay here. I want to build something with you, if you'll have me. Sarah Turner, Eli said softly. I've been hoping you'd say that since the day I found you by that creek. The next morning brought practical considerations. Sarah needed to retrieve her belongings from the storage unit in Phoenix, where she'd left them when she began her westward journey. She needed to close her old bank accounts and establish new ones. Most importantly, she needed to meet with the lawyer Eli had contacted to ensure her legal freedom was completely secure. I could come with you, Eli offered, as they planned the trip to Phoenix. Thank you, but I need to do this part myself, Sarah said. I need to walk back into that city as a free woman and close the door on that life once and for all. Eli understood. There were some battles that had to be fought alone, not because you lacked support, but because winning them yourself was part of the healing. The drive to Phoenix took 3 hours, and Sarah spent most of it thinking about the woman who had made this same journey in reverse 8 weeks ago. That woman had been broken, desperate, and running from everything she'd known. The woman making the return trip was different, stronger, clearer about her own worth, and finally running towards something instead of away from it. The lawyer's office was in downtown Phoenix, a glass tower that reflected the harsh desert sun. James Morisono, relation to David, he'd assured them with dry humor, was a man in his 60s with a kind of steady competence that came from decades of helping people navigate life's legal complexities. "The good news is that your divorce is absolutely final and legal," he told Sarah after reviewing all the paperwork. "The bad news is that your ex-husband's attempt to defraud you with those fake documents is going to result in serious criminal charges. You'll likely be called to testify at his trial." "I can handle that," Sarah said, and meant it. "There's one more thing," Morrison continued. "David's arrest has triggered an investigation into his business practices. Turns out using forged documents isn't a new strategy for him. The FBI is now looking into several of his consulting contracts with government agencies." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at the news. David's arrogance had finally led him to overreach, and his house of cards was collapsing. The storage unit held the remnants of her former life photo albums, her grandmother's china, teaching certificates and awards, books she'd collected over the years. As she sorted through the boxes, Sarah realized how little of it she actually wanted to keep. Most of these things belonged to a woman who had tried to make herself small enough to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. She kept the photo albums not for the pictures of David, but for the images of her parents, her students, and the rare moments when her genuine smile broke through. She kept her teaching materials and the small collection of first-edition children's books she'd treasured. Everything else she donated to charity, feeling lighter with each box she released. The final stop was her old bank, where she closed the accounts she'd shared with David and transferred everything to a new account in her maiden name. The banker, who had known her for years as Mrs. Morrison, seemed surprised by the transformation in her demeanor. "You look different," the woman said as she processed the paperwork. "Happier." "I am different," Sarah replied. "I finally remembered who I was before I became who I thought I should be." On the drive back to the ranch, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Amanda's number. David's former assistant had apparently decided to cooperate fully with the authorities. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that David made bail this morning." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Is he coming after me again?" "No. His lawyers have made it very clear that any contact with you would violate the terms of his bail. Plus, I think what happened at your ranch scared him. He's not used to people standing up to him." "What about you? Are you okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I quit. Today. I realized I didn't want to work for someone who would do what he tried to do to you." Another pause. "I'm sorry, Sarah. For my part in all of this, I believed his story about you being unstable, and I should have questioned it." "We all make mistakes," Sarah said gently. "The important thing is learning from them." After the call ended, Sarah found herself thinking about forgiveness, not the kind that excused bad behavior, but the kind that freed you from carrying other people's choices like stones in your heart. David had chosen to be controlling and manipulative. Amanda had chosen to believe convenient lies. But Sarah was choosing something different, to build a life based on truth, respect, and genuine partnership. As the familiar outline of the ranch came into view, Sarah felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the man waiting for her there. Eli's truck was parked in its usual spot, and she could see him working in the corral with the horses. She pulled into the yard and sat for a moment, watching him move with the quiet confidence she'd come to love. This was her life now, not the one she'd planned or the one others had chosen for her, but the one she'd fought for and won. When Eli looked up and saw her, his face broke into the smile she'd been carrying in her heart during the long drive home. As she walked toward him, Sarah realized she was no longer running toward an uncertain future. She was walking into a life she'd chosen, with a man who loved her exactly as she was, in a place where she could finally be completely herself. The legal battles might continue for months, but the war for her freedom was over. She had won not by force or manipulation, but by remembering her own worth and refusing to accept anything less than genuine love and respect. "Welcome home," Eli said when she reached him, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the courthouse in Phoenix, her hand resting on a leather portfolio that contained her testimony against David. The manila folder felt light in her hands, but she knew the words inside carried the weight of 25 years of manipulation and control and her final rejection of both. The courthouse was busy with the routine business of justice lawyers in expensive suits hurrying past with briefcases, families clustered together on benches waiting for their cases to be called, and the constant murmur of conversations about plea deals and sentencing guidelines. Sarah had arrived early, wanting time to center herself before facing David across a courtroom for what she hoped would be the last time. Eli sat beside her on the wooden bench outside courtroom 3, his presence as steady and reassuring as always. He wore his best shirt, the blue one that brought out his eye sand, had even trimmed his silver beard for the occasion. His weathered hands rested calmly in his lap, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. He was ready to protect her if needed, even here in this place where words were weapons and truth was the ultimate armor. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, not for the first time since they'd made the drive to Phoenix that morning. "Yes, I do," Sarah replied, her voice steady with conviction. "Not just for legal reasons, but for me. I need to stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth about what he did, not just the forged documents, but all of it. The manipulation, the control, the way he made me doubt my own reality." James Morrison, their lawyer, approached from down the hallway, his expression grim but determined. "Sarah, I wanted to prepare you for what we're walking into. David's attorney is going to try to paint you as an unstable woman who abandoned her family and is now seeking revenge through false accusations." Sarah nodded, having expected this strategy. "What do I need to do?" "Just tell the truth. Stick to the facts, stay calm, and remember that the jury will be watching David's reactions as much as they're listening to your words." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "You've been through worse than anything his lawyer can throw at you. You survived 25 years with David Morrison. You can certainly survive an hour of cross-examination." When their case was called, Sarah walked into the courtroom with her head high and her shoulders straight. The space was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate, which somehow made the proceeding feel more personal than she'd anticipated. David sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, and when he turned to look at her, Sarah felt nothing, no fear, no anger, no residual attraction. He was simply a man who had once controlled her life and no longer could. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet Reeves, called Sarah to the witness stand. As Sarah raised her right hand to be sworn in, she caught sight of Eli in the gallery, his eyes full of pride and support. That look gave her strength as she settled into the witness chair and faced the courtroom. "Please state your name for the record," Prosecutor Reeves began. "Sarah Elizabeth Turner," Sarah said clearly, using her maiden name with satisfaction. "And what is your relationship to the defendant?" "David Morrison was my ex-husband. We were divorced 6 months ago, after 25 years of marriage." The prosecutor led Sarah through the events of that day at the ranch, David's arrival with forged documents, his threats to have her committed, and his attempt to force her to return to Phoenix against her will. Sarah's voice remained steady as she described how David had tried to manipulate the legal system to regain control over her life. "Mrs. Turner," the prosecutor said, "the defendant claims that his actions were motivated by genuine concern for your mental health. How do you respond to that?" Sarah looked directly at David as she answered, "David Morrison was never concerned with my mental health. He was concerned with maintaining control over me. When I filed for divorce and left Phoenix to start a new life, I broke that control. The forged documents were his attempt to force me back into a situation where he could manipulate and diminish me again." "Can you describe the pattern of control you experienced during your marriage?" Sarah took a breath, then began to speak about the years of gradual erosion, how David had convinced her to give up her teaching career, how he'd isolated her from friends and family, how he'd made her doubt her own perceptions and judgment. She spoke about the affair with Amanda, about David's refusal to accept responsibility for his actions, and about the moment she'd realized that leaving was her only option for survival. "Did you abandon your family, as the defense has suggested?" "I left a marriage that was destroying me," Sarah said firmly. "I didn't abandon anyone, I saved myself." When Prosecutor Reeves finished her direct examination, David's attorney rose for cross-examination. Richard Carlyle was exactly the kind of lawyer David would hire: expensive, aggressive, and skilled at making victims feel like perpetrators. "Mrs. Turner," Carlyle began, his tone suggesting he didn't quite believe she deserved the title, "isn't it true that you left your marital home without warning, taking half of the couple's assets and disappearing for months?" "I left a marriage that had become emotionally abusive, yes. I took what was legally mine under Arizona's community property laws. And I didn't disappear. I moved to a new location and started a new life, which I had every right to do as a divorced woman." "But you weren't divorced when you left, were you? You were still legally married to my client." "I had filed for divorce and was living in accordance with the temporary orders issued by the court. The divorce was finalized while I was living at the ranch." Carlyle spent the next 20 minutes trying to poke holes in Sarah's story, suggesting she was vindictive, unstable, and seeking revenge against an innocent man who had simply been trying to help his troubled ex-wife. But Sarah had spent months preparing for this moment, not just in terms of legal strategy, but in terms of understanding her own truth. "Mr. Carlyle," she said during one particularly aggressive line of questioning, "I understand that your job is to defend your client. But I won't sit here and be gaslit again by another man who thinks my reality is negotiable." The courtroom fell silent at the steel in her voice. Even the judge looked impressed by her composure. "Isn't it true that you're living with another man now?" Carlyle pressed, clearly hoping to suggest impropriety. "Yes, I'm in a relationship with Eli Boone, the man who saved my life when I collapsed in the desert. Unlike my marriage to your client, this relationship is based on mutual respect, equality, and genuine love. And how do we know this isn't just another impulsive decision from a woman who clearly struggles with stability?" Sarah looked at David, then back at his lawyer. "Because for the first time in 25 years, I'm with someone who makes me feel more like myself, not less. Someone who supports my dreams instead of diminishing them. Someone who would never forge legal documents to force me to do something against my will." The final question came like a surprise attack. "Do you hate David Morrison?" Sarah considered the question seriously, looking once more at the man who had controlled so much of her life. "No," she said finally. "I pity him. He's so afraid of being alone that he'd rather have someone who doesn't want to be with him than no one at all. That's not love, that's possession. And I refuse to be possessed by anyone ever again." When she stepped down from the witness stand, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected: closure. Not the kind that came from revenge or punishment, but the kind that came from speaking truth in a place where truth mattered. She had faced her former abuser in a court of law and refused to be diminished by him one more time. As she walked back to her seat beside Eli, Sarah caught David's eye one final time. What she saw there wasn't anger or defiance, but something that looked almost like recognition, the acknowledgement that he had lost not just the case, but any claim to her life, her thoughts, or her future. The rest of the trial proceedings felt almost anticlimactic. Amanda testified about the forged documents, confirming Sarah's account of David's fraudulent scheme. Expert witnesses explained the legal implications of using falsified court orders. Character witnesses spoke about David's history of manipulative behavior in business dealings. When the jury returned with their verdict 3 hours later, Sarah felt Eli's hand slip into hers. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, and Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last chains of her former life finally fall away. David Morrison would face significant prison time for his crimes. More importantly, Sarah Turner was completely and irrevocably free to live the life she had chosen for herself. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Sarah realized she would never again have to look over her shoulder or wonder if her past was going to reach out and drag her backward. She was finally, completely, triumphantly free. The drive back to the ranch from Phoenix felt different than any journey Sarah had made before. She wasn't running from something or towards something uncertain. She was simply going home. Eli drove in comfortable silence, while Sarah watched the desert landscape roll past, each mile taking her further from the courtroom where she'd finally closed the door on her former life. "How do you feel?" Eli asked, as they passed the turnoff to the small town where they bought supplies. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Free," she said finally. "Really, truly free for the first time in my adult life." When they pulled into the ranch yard, Sarah noticed something different immediately. Pete's truck was there, along with several other vehicles she recognized from the community. String lights had been hung between the cottonwood trees, and she could see people moving around the porch and yard. "What's going on?" she asked. Eli's smile was mysterious. "Maybe you should go see for yourself." As they walked toward the house, people began emerging from various hiding spots. Pete and Rosa, Maisie from the diner, Sheriff Santos, Pastor Williams and his wife, and at least a dozen other members of their small community. A banner strung between two trees read, "Welcome home, Sarah," in Rosa's careful child's handwriting. "Surprise," Rosa called out, running toward Sarah with a bouquet of desert wildflowers. "We wanted to celebrate your victory." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she accepted the flowers and looked around at the faces of people who had become her chosen family. "How did you all know?" "Small towns have their ways," Pete said with a grin. "Word travels fast when one of our own wins a big battle." Maisie stepped forward with a covered dish. "I brought my famous enchiladas. Figured you might be too tired to cook after your day in court." "And I brought dessert," added Mrs. Williams, holding up a homemade apple pie. The impromptu celebration lasted until well after sunset. Sarah found herself surrounded by warmth and acceptance, listening to stories and sharing laughter with people who had embraced her not because of who she used to be, but because of who she'd become among them. When the last guests had gone home and the dishes were cleared away, Sarah and Eli found themselves alone on the porch under the string lights that Pete had insisted they leave up for atmosphere. The desert night was clear and cool, full of stars and the comfortable sounds of horses settling for the night. "I have something for you," Eli said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. But when he opened it, instead of an engagement ring, she found two simple gold bands, different from any wedding rings she'd ever seen. "I had these made by a jeweler in town," Eli said, his voice carrying a nervousness she'd never heard before. "They're not traditional wedding rings. I wanted something that represented us, not convention." Sarah picked up one of the rings, examining it in the soft light. Instead of being perfectly round, it had a subtle wave pattern, like the flowing lines of desert hills. The gold was warm and substantial, but not heavy. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Sarah Turner," Eli said, taking her hands in his weathered ones. "I know we've only known each other for a few months, but they've been the best months of my life since Margaret died. You've brought joy back to this place, and purpose back to my days." Sarah felt her heart racing as she looked into his kind eyes. "I'm not asking you to marry me because you need rescuing or because you need a place to belong," Eli continued. "I'm asking because I love the woman you are, strong, brave, compassionate, and completely yourself. I want to build a life with you, not because either of us is incomplete alone, but because together we're something even better." "Eli, let me finish," he said gently. "I know marriage might be a complicated concept for you, after what you've been through. These rings don't have to mean the same thing your first marriage meant. They can mean partnership, commitment, choosing each other every day, whatever you want them to mean." Sarah looked at the rings again, understanding what he was offering. Not ownership or control, but genuine partnership. Not a loss of identity, but a celebration of who she'd become. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I want to marry you, Eli Boone. I want to choose you every day for the rest of my life." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, not too tight, not too loose, but secure enough that she knew it would stay where it belonged. She did the same for him, marveling at how right it felt to be making this choice freely, without coercion or expectation. When? Eli asked, and she could hear the hope in his voice. Soon, Sarah said. I don't want to wait anymore. I've wasted too many years not living the life I wanted. They sat together under the string lights, admiring their matching rings and planning a simple ceremony that would reflect their values rather than society's expectations. They would marry at the ranch, surrounded by the people who had become their community. Pastor Williams would officiate, and Rosa would be the flower girl. It would be small, intimate, and completely authentic, like everything else they'd built together. As the night grew later, and they prepared to go inside, Sarah realized that this moment sitting on the porch of their ranch, planning their future together, was the real climax of her story. Not the courtroom victory or David's conviction, but this quiet choice to build something beautiful with someone who loved her exactly as she was. I never thought I'd want to get married again, she admitted as they turned off the string lights. And now, I understand the difference between marriage as a trap and marriage as a choice. Sarah took his hand as they walked toward the house. I choose you, Eli. I choose this life. I choose us. In the morning, they would start planning their wedding and their future. They would discuss Sarah returning to teaching at the small school in town and Eli's ideas for expanding the ranch's horse rescue operation. They would make plans and dream dreams and build the kind of partnership Sarah had never known was possible. But tonight was for holding each other close and marveling at how far they'd both traveled from the broken people they'd been before they found each other in the middle of the desert. Tonight was for celebrating not just survival, but the courage to reach for joy. As they fell asleep in each other's arms, Sarah's last conscious thought was gratitude for Eli's love, for her hard-won freedom, and for the unexpected truth that sometimes the best chapters of your life begin when you finally have the courage to write your own story. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the entrance to her new classroom at Desert View Elementary School, watching 23 third graders file in for the first day of the school year. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating hand-painted posters about kindness and growth mindset that she'd spent the summer creating. Her teaching certificate newly updated after 15 years away from the profession hung proudly on the wall beside photos of the ranch and the horses that had become such an important part of her healing journey. Good morning, class, she said as the children settled into their seats. My name is Mrs. Boone, and I'm excited to be your teacher this year. Mrs. Boone. The name still felt new on her tongue, chosen freely just 3 months ago, when she and Eli had married in a simple ceremony under the cottonwood trees at the ranch. The wedding had been everything Sarah had dreamed. It could be intimate, joyful, and completely authentic to who they were as a couple. Rosa, now 9 and more confident than the shy girl who had first visited the ranch, had indeed been their flower girl, scattering desert wildflower petals along the path Sarah walked to meet Eli. Pete had given her away, his weathered hand steady on her arm as he whispered, Margaret would have loved you, you know. The entire community had gathered to celebrate, bringing potluck dishes and heartfelt congratulations for the couple who had found love in the middle of nowhere. Now, as Sarah looked at her new students, some confident, some shy, all carrying their own stories and struggles, she felt the familiar joy of connecting with young minds. Teaching had always been her calling, and returning to it felt like coming home to herself. Who can tell me something interesting about the desert we live in? She asked, beginning the day with curiosity rather than rules. A boy in the front row raised his hand eagerly. My grandpa says it takes a long time for things to grow in the desert, but when they do, they're really strong. Sarah smiled, thinking of the cottonwood trees that sheltered their ranch, planted with hope and nurtured through drought until they became a haven for everything that needed their shade. That's very wise and very true. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the hardest places. During her lunch break, Sarah walked outside to the playground where children were running and laughing under the brilliant desert sun. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eli. How's the first day going, Mrs. Boone? She typed back, Perfect. The kids are wonderful. How are things at home? Thunder misses you. Buck, ate your hat. Rosa's here helping me fix the new gate. Can't wait to hear all about your day tonight." Sarah smiled, imagining the scene at the ranch. Rosa had become a regular fixture there, spending afternoons after school learning horsemanship and helping with chores. Her transformation from a shy, withdrawn child to a confident young girl who could handle horses twice her size had been remarkable to witness. The new gate Eli mentioned was part of their expansion project. They were officially becoming a horse rescue operation, taking in animals that needed rehabilitation and finding them new homes with people who understood their value. It was meaningful work that combined Eli's natural skill with horses and Sarah's teaching instincts. As the school day ended and children were picked up by parents or loaded onto buses, Sarah gathered her things and prepared for the drive home. The commute to town was 25 minutes each way, but she'd come to treasure that transition, time leaving the energy of the classroom behind and shifting into the peaceful rhythm of ranch life. The desert landscape that had once seemed harsh and forbidding now felt like an old friend, familiar in all its moods and seasons. She knew where the best wildflowers bloomed in spring, which arroyos filled with rushing water during summer storms, and how the light changed throughout the day across the vast sky. When she pulled into the ranch yard, the sight that greeted her made her heart swell with contentment. Eli was in the corral with Rosa, patiently guiding her through the process of introducing a new rescue horse to the herd. The wooden sign by the gate, Boone Ranch, Eli, Sarah, caught the late afternoon light, its fresh paint gleaming against the weathered fence posts. "How did it go?" Eli called out when he saw her approaching. "Wonderful," Sarah replied, climbing onto the fence rail to watch. "How's our new arrival doing?" "Better than expected. Rosa thinks she just needed to know she was safe." Sarah looked at the mare, beautiful paint with intelligent eyes and visible ribs that spoke of neglect before her rescue. Like so many of the animals they'd taken in, she would need time, patience, and consistent care to trust again. But Sarah had learned that healing was possible for any creature, given the right environment and enough love. That evening, as had become their custom, Sarah and Eli sat on the porch, sharing the events of their day. Rosa had gone home with Pete after dinner, chattering excitedly about the new horse and her plans to help with the training. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the horses moved peacefully in the pasture. "I got a letter today," Eli said, pulling an envelope from his shirt pocket. "From Amanda." Sarah looked up in surprise. David's former assistant had testified at the trial and then disappeared from their lives, starting over somewhere far from Phoenix and the mess she'd helped create. "What did she say?" "She's living in Colorado now, working for a non-profit that helps women escape domestic violence. She wanted us to know that David was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for the fraud charges." Sarah nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret at the news. David's fate was no longer her concern. He was simply a chapter in her past that had led her to this present moment. "She also said something else," Eli continued. "She said our story, how you found the courage to leave and build a new life, inspired her to make changes in her own life. She's going back to school to become a counselor." "Good for her," Sarah said, and meant it. Everyone deserved the chance to become the person they were meant to be. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 9 months ago, she'd been a broken woman collapsed beside a dry creek bed, having given up everything she knew for the slim hope of finding something better. Now she was sitting beside the man she loved, in the home they'd built together, planning lessons for students who would learn not just reading and math, but the value of resilience and growth. "Do you ever regret it?" Eli asked quietly. "Leaving everything behind to come here?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the comfortable house in Phoenix she'd abandoned, the social status she'd given up, the financial security she'd walked away from. Then she looked at the man beside her, weathered by sun and work and loss, but with eyes that held such kindness and love that she sometimes forgot to breathe when he looked at her. "Never," she said firmly. "I regret staying so long in a life that was making me smaller instead of larger. but I've never regretted the choice to leave or the choice to stay here with you. Even when I make you get up at dawn to feed horses. Especially then, Sarah laughed. I love our mornings. I love the work. I love the quiet. I love the way this place has taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the pieces of their separate heartbreaks. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and one of the horses whinnied softly in response. The desert night was alive with sounds and movements that city dwellers never noticed, but Sarah had learned to read the subtle language of this place that had become her sanctuary. Tomorrow's Saturday, Eli said eventually. Rosa wants to start working with the new mayor. And I need to finish setting up my classroom library, Sarah added. I found some wonderful books about desert animals that I think the kids will love. They made plans for the week and ordinary plans about fence repairs and lesson preparation and a trip to town for supplies, the kind of mundane, precious details that made up a life lived with intention and joy. As they prepared to go inside, Sarah paused to look at the wooden sign by the gate one more time. Boone Ranch, Eli, Sarah. It was more than just identification. It was a declaration of partnership, of shared purpose, of two people who had chosen each other and the life they wanted to build together. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we least expect them, Sarah thought, remembering the words that had begun this story. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what we were truly looking for. She'd lost a marriage, a house, a carefully constructed identity that had never really fit. But in losing those things, she'd found something infinitely more valuable, herself. And in finding herself, she'd discovered the capacity for a love deeper and truer than anything she'd known before. The desert that had once seemed like a place of exile had become a place of renewal. The man who had simply said, "You're coming with me," had become her partner in building a life neither of them could have imagined alone. And the woman who had collapsed beside a dry creek bed, broken and desperate, had risen stronger and more whole than she'd ever been. As they turned off the porch light and headed inside to the home they'd made together, Sarah smiled at the recognition that this wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of the best chapter yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, students to teach and horses to heal, fences to mend and dreams to pursue. But tonight was for gratitude, for love, and for the quiet satisfaction of a life lived authentically. Tonight was for holding close the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, and for marveling at the truth that sometimes the most beautiful things really do grow in the hardest places. In the middle of nowhere, two broken people had found each other and discovered that together they could build everything they'd ever wanted. And that, Sarah knew, was exactly where their real story began.